Okay, good morning, Dad.
Morning.
Today is Wednesday, June 9th. And how are you feeling?
I'm feeling fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, as your son, your 3-year-old son, often says, I had a good night's sleep.
Okay, that's good. Um, yeah, I've been feeling like our channel's becoming so much doom and gloom, and I'm wondering if I'm put things blowing it out of proportion because I've always
Ah,
been these videos out. It's like, the end is coming, this collapse, this system collapse.
right.
But is it possible that things aren't as horrible as I think they are, or because at the end of the day, everybody just wants to be able to, afford groceries. They want to be able to raise their kids, buy a
Right.
house, to, just live their life, unimpeded. They don't really care who rules them. If the empire collapses, that's maybe great, right? And so, should we
Yeah.
be so worried?
Well, um, you know, I think the doom and gloom is completely appropriate when we're talking about the Palestinians. It really looks bad. It is bad, and I just don't see any hope there. Now, I hope very, very much that I'll be proved wrong, but I just don't see it. But when we're talking about the world as a whole, first of all, yeah, okay, we have let's say, a dying empire that is lashing out in increasingly erratic ways, in very dangerous ways. There is a potential for, a much broader conflict than the conflicts that we all that we're observing now. And there's always the potential, the specter of nuclear war. I mean, that's true. There are things to be worried about. But at the same time, there is reason for hope. There is the rise of the BRICS, the rise of a multipolar world. It's not that the whole country is, or not the, I should say rather, the whole world is falling apart, but actually certain countries seem to be putting themselves together. For example, life in Russia is much better now than it was 20 years ago. Life in China is much better now than it was 20 years ago, and just miraculously better than it was, let's say, 45 years ago. So there are hopeful, encouraging developments. And then within the U.S., yeah, there are certainly storm clouds on the horizon, storm clouds on the horizon. Economic storm clouds. There's increasing polarization. Um, there's, I think, certainly rough times ahead, but we're still a prosperous country, and um, we still have, we have plenty of resources to, if they're used wisely by somebody. Right now, we don't see anybody using resources wisely, but it's not impossible. Who knows what the future might hold? We've talked about, the worst thing that could happen would be some sort of civil war, but secession, reform, like I've said, I have my doubts about the possibility of reform, but we could always be proved wrong. There are reasons to be hopeful, and just the fact that this global hegemonic order, that has become so irrational and in so many ways just so inhumane, cruel. It supports genocide. It just seems to support forever wars, and it doesn't just seem to. It does. Well, the fact that it's really on its way out. I mean, it's become increasingly obvious to more and more people, as we said. It was more powerful when it wasn't recognized for what it is, but increasingly it is recognized for what it is. And I think in part we ought to thank Donald Trump. He says the quiet part out loud. Often boasting about American power and him just wielding the hegemonic stick in very, very open ways. The world can see it. Americans can see it, or many of us can. And it's knowledge is the beginning of real reform, or at least of real change. So I think Americans are more awake to the reality than they ever have been. Certainly, the world is, and that those are encouraging developments.
Do you think that there is growing reality amongst the American people about just BRICS as a positive development? Do you think that's really happening, or do many people you think in the U.S. or within the West are doubling down on the Western side?
Well, I think most people aren't even aware of the BRICS. We're very much aware of it. And we know about all these conferences about the new, member countries and so on and so forth. Um, but but it gets very, very little coverage. It almost seems to be just there's a code of silence in effect um, among the media. And uh, this is obviously a major development, and something that should receive a lot of coverage, a lot of attention, but it receives very, very little coverage. So, I remember, I think it's true of this summit in Brazil that's just ended, right, and the one in Kazan. It was virtually ignored. Now, maybe this one in Brazil is we see more attention because of Trump's comments on it afterwards and his threats. He's probably drawn more attention to it than anybody else.
Well,
Again, he's
why is
performing
there?
that function. He says just because of his nature. Maybe a previous president would have said, "Oh yeah, the policy is to pretend it doesn't exist and minimize it." Well, he's incapable of doing that.
So that is the policy. That's why they have a code of silence. Just pretend like it doesn't exist.
Yeah, well, I think maybe it was particularly in the case of the Kazan meeting because, the narrative, of course, is that Russia is becoming increasingly isolated. And maybe that's part of the reason that in general BRICS is not discussed because the fact of BRICS, its growing influence and Russia's, very prominent role within BRICS is a statement that no, Russia is not isolated. Quite the reverse. Russia is becoming, more and more a part of this new emerging world order.
Would you say that the U.S. is more isolated than Russia?
Well, you know, but on certain issues, there's no question about it. Like when it comes to Palestine, but that's been true for decades, and just even more and passionately, the case now. UN votes would go against Israel and the U.S. It would be the Israel, U.S., and Fiji Islands on a lot of votes. Maybe a couple of other, very minor countries. Overwhelming votes against Israel and the U.S. So when it comes to Palestine, that's long been true. And now, that you get the same numbers, but there's a real emotional intensity behind that. So there is obviously an isolation when it comes to Middle East policy. That the U.S. is isolated, you just can't say. It still is the leading superpower, and it has close ties to many, many countries around the world. The great majority of countries in the world. But it is becoming kind of along with Israel, a pariah in moral terms. There are these trade relations and diplomatic relations and military, relationships. These kind of things don't disappear overnight, right? They're still there. So we're not isolated, and we still have a lot of influence. But clearly, we don't have the influence that we used to have. Um, so I wouldn't say that we're isolated. You say that maybe we're on a trajectory towards increasing isolation, the U.S. and Europe, and largely because of its support of the genocide in Palestine, um, and that Russia seems to be on the opposite trajectory. Neither of them are isolated.
Yeah, I just feel that nobody likes America anymore. Around, I mean, Americans don't like America. The only country that likes America is Israel. That's one of the reasons why nobody likes America, right? It
Right.
just so I just feel like if there's that sentiment, I mean, obviously there are individuals, but I would say the overwhelming majority of the world is fed up with the American empire, is fed up with the United States and the way that it's running things, including Americans themselves. So that just
Mhm.
has to mean that we are going to be more isolated in just so many ways. Or you just said it, it's that trajectory, I
Yeah.
guess. It takes a while, things are in motion. But
Right.
that isolationism, I mean, what will that do to that will kill the empire, right? Slowly over time. I mean, can we hope for some type of
Yeah.
change? I mean, how do you see that
Yeah.
isolationism?
Well, again, it's like we've said, there are really three pillars, right? There's the soft power pillar, there's the military pillar, and the economic. And the soft power pillar is the one that is crumbling the fastest, and we see it happening before our eyes. The others, you have to say there's a lot of institutional inertia. When it just comes to diplomatic and military relations, these relationships are built up over decades, and they just don't disappear overnight. They take a while to really change. So, what was your question again? I'm sorry, I just
Hi, that's fine. I'll just move on. But BRICS is right, we talk about this moral pillar, but is BRICS really more of a threat to the economic pillar? Is that what is that what the U.S. is afraid of? It sounds
yeah,
like Trump seems afraid. I mean, that's what his
yeah,
tweet sounds like. It's
right,
like that him just bringing attention to it is just
right,
showing like, oh, I'm worried about this.
yeah. Well, I know that he said that earlier in during his current term in office. He said that it's a threat to the U.S. dollar. He said that quite plainly, and that's what he's afraid of. And I'm sure there are other people in the establishment that are quite worried about that. And some of them have voiced it openly. They just have admitted that the weaponization of the dollar has had deleterious effects on its status as the world's reserve currency, has threatened that status. Um, so I think that's what clearly scares him, and that's why we got the threat to slap 10% tariffs on all BRICS members and other countries aligned with the BRICS, which just seems really absurd.
Right, but I mean that's just proving the point of BRICS, though. That's what's so strange to me about it. It's like, oh, you said the weaponization of the dollar. Well, don't weaponize the dollar. That's under our control. It's not
Yeah,
that that BRICS is attacked. We're attacking
right,
ourselves with these
right.
actions, right?
Yeah. So actually, to deal with this problem, which has in large part arise from the weaponization of the dollar, Trump is threatening to weaponize the dollar further. A lot of countries are in BRICS or looking at BRICS because they are worried about the U.S. They're worried about becoming a target of U.S. weaponization of the dollar. And so the BRICS they see as again an opportunity to protect themselves from those kind of attacks, to have alternatives. They can. It used to be that the world financial system was completely dominated by the U.S. and there just weren't any alternatives. So, if you cross the U.S. and if you provoked U.S. ire, you're in danger of having your economy, if not shut down, subject to very severe and damaging sanctions. But now with BRICS, you have there's this whole alternative system that that you can resort to. That if in fact you see the U.S. coming for you, you have a place to go, you have a sanctuary, and that really changes things. Now, by threatening to impose 10% tariffs on all BRICS members and all countries aligned with the BRICS, I don't know if that would be probably most of the world. Um, he's probably just overall just reinforcing the the reasons that these countries are going into the BRICS in the first place. They say, there it is. Do we need further proof? He's threatening us. The U.S. is threatening us again. And so
Yeah.
it's actually quite silly. I suppose there are some small countries on the fence that might be scared away from BRICS because of this, but most of the countries, I think all the ones in BRICS are in there in part because they understand that this is a problem and this is simply going to reinforce their thinking.
Yeah, and there's a problem with Trump just issuing global threats via tweet.
Yeah,
Like what does this mean? He
yeah,
says any country align themselves with the anti-American policies of BRICS.
yeah,
So what does that mean? Anti-American? Just doing
yeah.
trade with
Right,
China? Is that anti-American?
right,
So
exactly. Because
nobody
they are
knows what to
not.
do.
Right. I mean, it clearly isn't anti-American, in any really meaningful sense. It's just it's an alternative. Again, that members of BRICS are free to trade with the U.S., free to use dollars. It's but it threatens global hegemony just by providing that alternative. It is not an anti-American, alliance, or organization of any kind. It could become that, over time if the U.S. is increasingly hostile to it. That's what we've seen. It's just like these different countries, like Russia and China, initially were reluctant to really to cooperate, to create a bloc. That's what they've said. But because of unrelenting U.S. hostility and Western hostility directed against those countries, they are in fact forming a bloc, a de facto bloc. They're forced to, by this Western hostility. And I think that there's potentially the same thing could happen with BRICS. But right now, BRICS is going out of its way not to be an anti-American organization, but simply, again, to provide alternatives. But this is too much. Because obviously alternatives, that's, that does undermine hegemony.
Right. So do you look at it as a battle between BRICS and the United States, or BRICS is just kind of it's doing its thing and the U.S. is trying to pick a fight with it?
Yeah, well, it is the role of the U.S., it is its behavior, that is giving impetus to the growth of BRICS. There's no question about it. But but you can't really point to any policy and say this is specifically anti-American or even anti-Western. It's just it is about multipolarity. So it is. I don't know how you can actually go after the BRICS and attack it without actually admitting that you're trying to enforce hegemony. I think that is what's going on here.
So how powerful is BRICS? I mean, we don't want to look at it like the U.S. versus the Soviet Union, right? This is
No,
something
it's
this is
nothing like that.
it's completely different, right? So I mean, like it's not a military alliance.
No.
It's like what is it? Yeah, why is it scaring the U? I mean, I guess I know why. It's because it's just the threat to U.S. hegemony. That's it. So
Right.
it's just something that's
Right.
going to just continually grow, just offer this alternative
Right.
system.
Yeah. Now, um, that the BRICS really is still more of an idea than a real organization. They are building up these institutions, like alternative banks, for example, and I guess there's a reinsurance system that they're working on, and a payment system. Um, but they actually haven't done this. They're going forward with it. The work is being done on it, but I guess these things take a lot of time. I don't know when they'll actually go into effect. Some of it, I think, like the bank is already there. Other things, like the payment system, is still on the drawing board. Um, I think it's just that maybe the more important aspect of it right now is that when you join it, you have access, or increased access to these other countries that have already learned to deal with U.S. hegemony in different ways. They by paying in their own currencies and that kind of thing. And so you're able to pick their brains, get advice from them. That's something, and it can be actually very, very important. And um, but it's really, there's really not a whole lot of meat on the bones right now with the BRICS. Eventually, I expect there will be, it'll be something more substantive. Again, there will be an alternative to the SWIFT system, for example. Um, yeah, we'll just have to wait and see. Now, the BRICS I think, is potentially it's vulnerable just because it has so many members, and a lot of these members are kind of, you could describe them as fence sitters or neutral countries. They're not. They try to maintain very good relations with the U.S. and they do to a certain extent, like India and Brazil. Those are two of the founding members there. But there was some question about how to what extent India was supporting the BRICS, but it seems like Modi's come out with some very strong statements in support of it quite recently. Now, I think maybe at this recent summit. And Lula seems to be really quite enthusiastic about going ahead with it. So, maybe those worries about those members were unjustified. Now but you just know the U.S., you know how they can't stand the idea of, let's say, alternative centers of power. That's why they go after Russia, China, Iran, and so on, because these are countries that refuse to bow down, essentially. And BRICS is an organization that refuses to bow down. So you know that there has to be a great deal of nervousness about it. And, I imagine that there will be efforts to go after the weaker links and to sabotage BRICS in some way. Maybe it's already underway, probably is. But so far, BRICS seems to be moving forward, not rapidly, but it seems to be moving forward.
How would that work? Sabotaging BRICS, attacking one of its weaker links?
Well, a color
Regime
revolution. yeah, regime change. It's just, one thing is, well, like when you're talking about India and Brazil, these are very big countries, so it is harder. They do, just by virtue of being large, they're less vulnerable. They're not like a Georgia, where you can just have your NGOs pay a certain number of people to go out and, it failed in Georgia, good for the Georgians, but you can apply real pressure. It's on those smaller countries, and often successfully. But it's much harder to do in the case of India or, let's say, Brazil, a country like that. But I don't know. These people are very creative. They find levers that they can pull. Who knows?
Yeah, I would just say that I believe the U.S.'s ability to sabotage something like this is greatly diminished because everybody just knows what's going on. If any country all of a sudden just rises up and says, yeah, we love America, we're like, okay, something's fishy going on. Nobody's doing that now. Everybody's upset. Everybody's upset with what's happening, what the U.S. is doing in the Middle East. Wow, it's being, saying, we'll bomb you, tariff you. Nobody likes it. So if any country is all of a sudden like, hurrah, let's throw off the shackles and embrace U.S. hegemony, everyone's like, well, okay, all right, CIA, we know what's going on. So it's not going to happen. Right. I just don't think it can happen so easily.
Well, one country I think where that is happening right now is actually Armenia, and where Pashinyan is clearly reorienting the country to the West and is doing everything he can to make Armenia part of the EU and part of NATO, and it remains to be seen if he'll succeed. It seems he's going now after the very ancient, Armenian Apostolic Church in a big way. And
are the people in Armenia, are they on board with?
Yeah, I have trouble believing that they are. I don't know what the recent polls have showed, but I think we may find that Armenia is like Georgia. Georgia for a while it seemed to be a win for the U.S., but in the end, now it's looking like no. The Georgians had enough of it, and they haven't officially renounced or rescinded their application for EU membership, but in truth, it seems clear that they actually don't want to go down that path anymore. It's not like they've become pro-Russian, but they have become resolutely pro-Georgian. And we may see the same thing happen in Armenia. They're similar countries, similar inside. They're both very ancient countries and have people with a real sense of pride, like the Iranians, another very ancient country. And so I don't know enough about Armenia, but I'm just guessing like Pashinyan's policies, they're just so overtly pro-Western and often and to the extent that he's clearly sacrificing the interests of Armenia. And that if Armenia is anything like Georgia, it's going to fail. We'll see.
So this Pashinyan, he's kind of a puppet of the West, is basically what you're saying. But
yeah,
he's probably
he's a willing puppet of the West. This is clearly, it's something that he believes in. Like, you find people like that in Georgia. It's the same thing, but they are a minority. and I assume that that kind of person is a minority in Armenia too. And if he goes too far, and he's probably already gone too far, there will be a backlash. They'll see what's up.
Yeah. This just reminded me of something. Do we remember what happened in South Korea with that whole little military coup, and then what happened with that? Did he ended up getting ousted? It sounded like there was like North Korean uniforms. It looks like he was trying to stage something. I don't know. The whole thing was kind of strange.
Right.
And then
he's out of power, and there is a new a president in power who is actually much less of a neocon than he was, and is looking to improve relations with North Korea and with Russia. Maybe not a dramatic break from what he was doing, but clearly a change of direction. And what last I heard is that that charges were being filed against that former president. That he may be put on trial soon, and he may be convicted of crimes. There was an obvious attempt at a military coup there.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if that, we've kind of forget about Asia, South Korea, and Japan are part of this like NATO plus, NATO observer nations or whatever. But I wonder if they probably looking at what's happening in Europe and in the Middle East, and just like, they don't want to be associated with it, right? I mean, I understand how much the European countries are vassals to the United States. Their subordination is sickening. But do you have that same level of subordination in countries like South Korea and Japan? I feel like they have more autonomy.
Their foreign policies anyway have been really, I think, generally just subordinated to U.S. foreign policy. Now, there are military bases in both of those countries, and they accept that they're part of this U.S. They're not part of NATO, but they're under U.S. military protection, and that does have a real impact on their foreign policy. It gives them some wiggle room. Again, like the current president isn't such an avid neocon as the previous one was. But by and large, they tend to outsource. My knowledge of this is limited, but they tend to outsource their foreign policy to the U.S. Now, they've had independent economic policies, and they've resisted U.S. pressure. Sometimes they give in. Japan actually made some major changes to their economic policy as a result of U.S. pressure. But they are a proud people, and they do value their independence. And what they've had remarkable achievements in the areas of economic development and technology, and that. The economic development in particular is being threatened by the current president. I mean, this is something that you say, there's plans to make them kind of part of NATO plus and so on and so forth. Well, it was just the other day that Trump threatened, or actually he imposed new sanctions, at least 25% on both South Korea and Japan, to go into effect on August 1st. These are the U.S.'s allies in the Far East. And this is the treatment they're getting. So, we're saying they're looking at what's happening around the world. They're clearly looking at what's happening to themselves here. This has got to anger them greatly, and cause them to question the long-term relationship with the United States. This is not something a friend is supposed to do to them.
Right. Do you think this security arrangement that South Korea and Japan have with the U.S. actually makes them safer?
Well, I think so. Because I just, like, for example, if you're North Korea, if you really had thoughts of conquering, unifying Korea, you'd have to say, well, if we do launch an attack, we would, because there are U.S. soldiers right there. They're essentially regarded. Everybody understands that they're tripwire forces. There's not a sufficient number to actually stop an attack, but they would be there in the line of fire. Some of them would be killed, and that would bring in the U.S. And that has to affect North Korean calculations. Now, I don't think anybody has any notions of attacking Japan, but if if a future Chinese government did, it would certainly, pause and consider the fact that Japan is under the U.S. nuclear umbrella. I mean, it's there. I think it does provide them with some kind of security.
Yeah, I
Now
guess.
that, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, my train of thought was just thinking that if I was one of these countries, I would start to be getting a bit concerned because of the United States posture towards China. And it's like, okay, well, if you guys are going to really try to start a war with China, then you're dragging us into it. Where's the launch pad for this going to be? It's going to be out of our bases in Japan and South Korea, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh great, now we got to go to war with China as well, and so. It just seems like that's the biggest risk for me. And I'd be like, okay, I don't like that the fact that we have the security arrangement with the United States, but they are antagonizing our most powerful neighbor in the region. They're pushing them, which means that we're going to be involved in this fight.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. That's true. That's the danger. It certainly is. Of course, the most likely flashpoint would be Taiwan, or it could be somewhere else in the South China Sea. And yeah, by virtue of being a member of this alliance, they become targets. Whereas before, they, as neutral countries, they could stay out of it. It'll be harder for them to stay out of it if a war, in fact, does break out. There's no question about it.
Do you think if the U.S. empire collapses or the U.S. just pulls completely out of South Korea, that there is a big risk that North Korea will just go straight on down? I mean, I used to always think like, this is silly. Why are we in South Korea? Because the GDP of South Korea is so large. It's such a wealthy, powerful country. They can take care of themselves. Why are we over there? Mm-hmm. But then, just recently in the past 3.5 years, just watching what's developed in Ukraine, I realized that, North Korea is pretty powerful militarily. There's something to be said about having all of your production go into that military. Like, they make some pretty good equipment. So,
right.
Maybe not.
Yeah, maybe not. Yeah. It might not be such a... we've learned that you can't just look at GDP. I know I made that mistake with respect to the Ukraine war. Because again, you look at GDP and especially if you look at nominal GDP terms, it's just the countries of NATO absolutely dwarf Russia. Russia is a midget compared to them, but Russia has proved to be a giant. It's outproducing all of them. Mark Rutte, the NATO General Secretary, again, I think he said this for the third time just very recently. Once again, he said that Russia is outproducing all of NATO. It can produce more in 3 months than it takes for Russia to produce in just Russia can produce more in 3 months than all of NATO can produce in a year.
Right, I actually have it right here because I wanted to bring that up. Because Margar said Moscow is producing 3 times as much ammunition in 3 months as the whole of NATO is doing in a year. I mean, first of all, that's a weird way of saying 12 times as much, right? Why say it like that? That's weird.
Yeah. You're right. I know that's a new statement from him. Before he's talked about just not just ammunition. Now I don't know if that's true. If you do that, he said that once, and maybe he got kind of he confused things in his mind at the moment. I wouldn't put too much weight on that because 12 times as much is a little bit hard.
That's what I thought.
Let's get some corroboration. I'm not going to go with that. But he has repeated made that other statement, which was 4 times as much for all military production. He's made that, I think, at least 2, probably 3 times over the last several months. Yeah, so I think it must be based on something. And
I mean, that's just crazy in itself, and the fact that we've talked about this so many times, just how we've been just attrited so heavily munitions wise in the Ukraine war. I mean, and then just the human lives that have been attrited, the Ukrainian lives in Ukraine. But it sounds like Trump has just been such a disappointment. It just sounds like he is just all in now on the Ukraine war. He's saying, who knows? He changed his mind all the time, but he's saying like Putin's feeding him a bunch of bullshit, and he's really mad at Putin. And now we're going to be sending weapons back to Ukraine. It's just like, okay, this grind is going to continue until what? There's just no more men left in Ukraine, that they're all dead. Like, this is just, it's insane. Like, and we're just saying that what Mark Rutte is saying is just an open admission that there's one country, Russia, that has close relations with very powerful military producers like China and North Korea. I mean, North Korea produces a ton of artillery shells. North Korea probably produces more artillery shells than all of NATO. Do you know if that's true or not?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if anybody, maybe outside of the intelligence community really knows how many they produce. But I think it appears to be substantial, and I think they are supplying a certain amount. We just don't know how
right.
many. Yeah, to Russia right now. And then China, apparently they don't supply weapons directly. They haven't been. That's been their policy. But just they can supply all kinds of other things, components and machine tools and whatever. They obviously are very, very important to the Russian economy and therefore to the Russian MIC.
Right. I mean, just the point being is that it's clear that Russia doesn't even need the help, but it can get help if it needs it. But even without any help, it's just, it's and got again, this easily with one hand tied behind its back. It can handle all of what NATO's throwing at it. Right. So it's just like, why do we still want to keep this war? You just like, why do you want to, what's the point? What's the point of Trump and NATO saying like, we got to do this. Okay.
Yeah. Right. When they provide a reason, and they've been providing this reason for nearly 3 years, it's always to improve. Usually it is, especially during the first year. They're talking first year and a half or so. They often talked about actually winning the war, and taking back Crimea and all that. You don't really hear that anymore. But starting, nearly, over 2 years ago, they've been regularly saying, providing as their reason for their support for Ukraine, just the need to improve Ukraine's bargaining position, just say strengthen their negotiating position so they can get a settlement that's favorable to them. Now stop and think, what's happened over that period of time that they've been making this argument. Every time some European leader comes out and says this, it's always Ukraine's bargaining position is worse than it was the previous time somebody said that. It gets worse and worse, every day. It does. And there's no reason to believe that that's going to change. You can see the trajectory that Ukraine is on. So, what are you talking about? If you want to graph it, like their bargaining position, it's steadily dropping, declining. And so, you're making these statements. Well, where's the point where all of a sudden it's going to go back up and it's going to actually, is there any reason to believe that? Again, Mark Rutte is telling the truth about this. And then the Trump administration is also telling the truth about the lack of production capacity in the West. So, and then even if you could start producing a lot of weapons, the Ukrainians themselves are saying that we just lack the manpower. They're talking about conscripting women this fall. This is a desperate country, and just let's wake up to reality. If you love Ukraine, you hate Russia or whatever, you ought to, if I don't care that that's your position, you think Putin's a monster, well, stop the fighting, take the deal that you have, because it's getting worse, and it's been getting worse steadily for well over 2 years. The last time that the Ukrainians made any gains, was in the fall of 2022. That's nearly 3 years ago. And ever since then, it's gotten steadily worse, and that decline, in fact, is accelerating. So what are you doing? You're just going to wait. Well, because you refuse to admit the reality, you claim to be, you're so concerned with your own moral purity, you're going to sacrifice all of Ukraine.
But I mean, people like Trump, Mark Rutte, Zelensky, Starmer, all these people, they have to know that this is true. So what is the reason? Is it is it as callous as just, well, I don't want to look bad and we're making a lot of money with the MIC, so we'll just keep it going. I don't care how many Ukrainians die. When we say to the last Ukrainian, we mean it. I mean, I don't understand if they know that every day it's getting worse, that relative powers of Russia is increasing rapidly compared to NATO. NATO is just being exposed as a paper tiger that doesn't have any production capacity. That, oh, NATO, the greatest fighting force in the world, but you have zero industrial capacity. So when
Yeah.
there's a real war, you can't make anything. So, the, what why is that? Is it just to grift? Is it as callous as like the people in charge in Ukraine are just like, let's just keep the money flowing as much as we can, and they kick back to other people, everybody's getting paid, let's just let these people die and just keep it going, and then maybe we can make off as a bandit and, I don't know, live in the
Well, yeah, I think
Caribbean or something.
there's something to that. That's part of it. There's, I think, no question about it. I think I just saw this morning, it was actually a statement by a Ukrainian dissident. Somebody who actually supports the Ukrainian effort in large, but is very critical of the government, and said, well, look, if this government were truly concerned about winning this war, why do you have this extensive corruption? All these people that have clearly been actually diverting resources that should be going to the front into their own pockets, and these people are still in power. So yeah, I think it's probably true of a number of people anyway in the Ukrainian regime. It is for them a grift, but then let's not forget the very real Banderite ideology that has become dominant in Ukraine over the last several years, and that is it is above all anti-Russian. It's just that seems to be at the core of it, is hating Russia. And for these people, they simply cannot. I think I've said this before, but it really seems to be true. They would, in the end, rather die. They would rather, that Ukraine itself cease to exist than to actually bend their knee to Russia. I don't know if that's quite what they think, but that's the effect of what they think.
Is that just the people in charge, or is that, you think, the majority of the Ukrainian population now
I don't
in
think
West
it's the
Ukraine?
majority of the Ukrainian population, but it's an important minority. It's just that the Ukrainians made a real devil's bargain back in 2014, after the coup, the Maidan coup. At that time, the Banderites were fringe, but they had the most potent military fighting forces. And so when conflict broke out, it was really a matter of this new regime attacking the eastern provinces, the Donbass. They had to pursue that war. They had to rely on these Banderites because that's where the muscle was, and it was true of the coup itself. Let's remember, it's like there was a false flag operation that preceded the coup. That was kind of the immediate cause of the coup, and it was again the Banderites who carried that out. They were firing from rooms in a certain hotel right there on the square. So they made this bargain with the devil. It's just like, okay, yeah, these people are kind of nutty. A lot of people in the Ukrainian government thought that way. They were really more interested in joining the West, but they had these Banderites. They're the muscle. They're the guys with the guns. They can do the dirty work. And so they did. And the problem is they fed the beast. And that over time, now they have I don't think they represent the majority of people there, but they have taken control of certain important, certainly within the military. Now we have it's really the descendant of the Azov battalion, which became brigade, it grew in size, and now is an entire army group with 50,000 soldiers in it. 50,000 committed Banderites, heavily armed, and these people are willing to fight. They're not like so many of the conscripts. We can see clearly those people do not want to fight in the other units. So it gives them a great deal of power within the military, but it's also true, within various departments, education, whatever, that Banderite policies are being pursued. And I think there's no question that it's affected. They have control over the propaganda organ. Zelensky himself has become, in so much of his thinking, a Banderite. He originally wasn't, but it's just like that's the atmosphere. They did this bargain with the devil, and that's what they're becoming certainly at the top. Now, I think it's affected the thinking of a lot of Ukrainians, but um, as best as far as I can tell, it's not like they're really sincere believers in this ideology, and they would just as soon, again, that this war would end. But they just, the larger population really doesn't have any say in things. There are no elections, and they don't have any control of these institutions. They're just they're victims of this.
Do we know what percentage of recruits in Ukraine are being forcefully conscripted now, or is that information not really publicly
Yeah, I
available?
haven't seen that.
I
You do
saw
get
something 75%, but I don't know if that's true. So I didn't want to. I don't know if
Yeah,
that's been
that's
corroborated.
believable. I mean, that's what it's actually. I've seen reports from commanders, Ukrainian commanders, just complaining and say like these guys just don't want to fight. And now I didn't see any firm numbers, but you're talking about a majority. Like most of these people there, they haven't been trained. They don't want to be there. Sometimes they do fight. Well, they do because they get stuck in to save their own lives. They start shooting, right? Um, that's what happens. I think that happens in every war to some extent or another. It's part of this instinct for self-survival kicks in and makes some kind of soldier out of you. But they're not very effective soldiers. They don't want to go on assaults. They don't. You need the crazies to do that. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't have any firm numbers on that, but I think it's clear. I mean, it's not just all the videos that we've seen, but that their recruitment efforts are failing. Their efforts to mobilize the population, they're falling short, and the Ukrainians themselves are admitting that. So if you had a lot of willing members of society, then that would not be a problem, right? They would be signing up. And then they, in that the 25 and under category, which is now off limits to conscription, for the time being, they did have a voluntary program. They have something very similar to what the Russians are, have been doing. They did offer really generous packages, as the Russians do. But they get a lot of young men and sign up for this, and
In Russia.
in Russia, right?
Mhm.
So we were talking about something like 35 or maybe even 40,000 a month, and that's been going on for a long time. Now they tried to do the same thing earlier this year in Ukraine, and the response was pathetic. It was admitted to by the Ukrainians themselves. We're talking about hundreds, 500 in a month or something like that. So there just isn't that willingness to go to the front, even with a generous package. So yeah, I think that 75% figure is probably correct. Maybe even higher than that. There's just really no desire on the part of individual Ukrainians average Ukrainians to go out there and fight this war. For a government that they recognize as corrupt. Maybe they hate the Russians, but they don't want to get killed by the Russians. It's
Do we have any idea what the casualty numbers are, or do you think we will ever
I
find
don't
out what
know.
they are?
It really is hard to say, and all I can say that it appears to, if you just look at the Ukrainians, they are hurting for Manpower. They themselves say that their their various battalions are often at less than 50% strength. They are bleeding men, and they're not able to replace them. And just so the fact again that people are so afraid, even with generous offers to go to the front, that suggests that the Ukrainians themselves, maybe they don't know the numbers, but they know it's bad.
Mm.
And that doesn't give us a firm answer, but it's got to be very bad. I mean, they the loss of manpower. Why do they have that loss of manpower? They're a lot of their men are being killed. And then in Russia, they continue their voluntary program. Yeah, they offer these generous packages, but if it was really bad for the Russians, even if you say, well, I could really make a bundle out of this and get a good start in life if I go and sign up for this. But yeah, but it's a 1 in 10 chance I'm going to get killed, or and another 20% chance that I'll be severely injured or something. You look at that and say, no, I don't want to do that. It's They have to have a sense because they have friends that have been in there and they talk to them. That's how it is. That's how it's going to be in any country, and the losses are real. Clearly a lot of Russians have been killed over the course of the last 3 years, but they're not so bad that that this recruitment effort has run into any obstacles. But on the Ukrainian side, clearly it has. And I think that speaks volumes, even if we don't know the exact numbers.
Right, right. It's interesting how these ideologies sort of capture a country or a government. We often when you see these people in power, politicians, you don't think about just that there's one overriding ideology that develops the worldview for a whole system. But that's what we kind of have. We have Banderism, that's the taking control in Ukraine, and then we have Zionism that's taking control. I mean, Israel, but also within the United States. And I think prior to October 7th, I think most people in the world didn't really look at our politicians and see that there was this ideology of Zionism that was guiding a lot of our foreign policy principles. Mm-hmm. But now it's becoming apparent that there is this, that how does that happen? That we just get that an ideology can just creep in and capture and take control of a whole government system and unleash all this chaos.
Well, I think it's a well-known fact in political science that it's like groups that are highly motivated and organized, even when they're numerically very small, can have an outsized impact. They can end up like winning the battle, so to speak. You may have a country, you can do the polls, and 90% of the people think this way, but there's a group of people with 5%, and they are really committed. The others, it's 90% mush. It's just like these are not. They're maybe just kind of inherited habitual opinions, not really deeply felt in many cases. And then you have these people that are committed zealots, and they can by seizing the commanding heights of the culture, really enforce their opinion. They can shape the views because that majority is soft and malleable. Unfortunately, it's true. Most people just don't have a real, firm, really, really firm principles. They just try to get along and, be a part of their society. And when their society changes on them, well, okay, they just they change with it. And they're not, often they don't understand that, well, it's changed because there are people who work to make a change. Those are the people that are really committed and zealous. And Zionism is an example of that. And I think Banderism is too.
Should we almost view the whole state of Israel as that? As this,
Yeah.
So that as they have that control, they're very organized and they're a small population, but that's how a country of 7 million Jewish Israelis are able to exert this much control over the United States because they're highly motivated.
Yeah,
highly organized.
No, it's true. I mean, it is just a fact. There's a lot of the mega donors are Jewish Zionists. The leading ones on both sides of the aisle. They are. So I mean, part of it is money, but it is also, it's like with Zionism, it's control of the media. The New York Times has been owned by Jewish Zionists for a long, long time, and you find that, I know this sounds like a crazy anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, but it's just a fact. It really is, and I think we can talk about it now. It was harder to talk about it before, but it's just become, more apparent. Now in the U.S., we do have to also admit that Christian Zionism, again, it is an independent phenomenon. I kind of assumed that it was almost just like an offshoot, something created by Jewish Zionists, but it is an independent phenomenon. It's something that actually, to a certain, only slightly, but actually predated the rise of Jewish Zionism. So that's something too that strengthens the power, but it's of Zionism within this country. Yesterday I watched a documentary which I would recommend to all our viewers called "The Day Israel Attacked the U.S." and it's about the USS Liberty, and a lot of the survivors are interviewed in there, and it's really quite extraordinary. It's not just what happened, which was just horrifying on that day, but what happened afterwards in the cover-up, and that's where we see these levers that Israel has. It's just that Johnson, who was president at the time, was actually to date the most pro-Israel president. But he knew what happened, that the Israelis had actually attacked and attempted to sink the USS Liberty, killed 34, injured 170, injured or killed 2/3 of the people on board, very nearly sunk it. And they were doing everything they could to kill everybody. They actually deliberately strafed the lifeboats, for example, and then they destroyed the antenna that sent a distress signal. So it was only because of the courage of one individual that managed to actually climb up a tower and attach a wire that they were able to send out a distress signal. And it was only after that the Israelis themselves heard that distress signal go out. There was a U.S. fleet about 500 miles away, and they knew that the U.S. at that point knew what was going on. So only then did they call off the attack. But anyway, so we could go into that in greater detail. I would highly recommend it, that documentary. It was put out by Al Jazeera. But the
man, our country, such traitors are.
Yeah, I know. It's horrifying. I was really sickened. I knew about it, but this actually just drove it home. What a horror, And these poor guys, these very brave, completely innocent. They had so much trouble believing what was happening to them. But there's no question about it. What was happening, that the Israelis were deliberately targeting, trying to kill them all. And
our greatest ally, ladies and gentlemen, our greatest ally.
Right. Yeah. Now, the thing is, Johnson knew what happened. And actually, I think initially he was really shaken and very upset about it. And in fact, he told the reporters of Newsweek off the record that it was a deliberate attack by Israel. But then the Israelis were alarmed, and they realized, this is our pro-Israel guy. We got to get him back online. They just started applying the pressure, because there were a lot of people in his administration, that had close ties to Israel, that were Israel firsters, kind of like the current administration. It was true back then. It was less open then than it is now. But they pulled all the levers that they had, and it was just, and in the end, like, what made Johnson shut up is that they made it clear to him that if you go public with this will be considered blood libel, and you will be you will be labeled an anti-Semite. And there was actually the fear of that. And there were other incentives and pressures, but that was a great part of what led to the cover-up. And it was, all these people were told, don't talk about it. The wives of the victims, the ones who died, were told, don't talk about this, And a lot of them didn't talk about it for years, but now they do. They have a ceremony, every year in Washington D.C. at the Navy Memorial, and but you could see it back then. I mean, it was just so clearly. It was, Israel did control U.S. policy in this regard, and the whole, this was the fateful decision. I mean, if Johnson had shown moral courage and stood up to them, maybe we wouldn't be where we are now. But it was like when he caved in, it was the Israelis understood. As one of the survivors, or one of the people involved in all this, said, the Israelis from that day forward understood that they could get away with anything, and now we are where we are today.
It's all so depressing. It's so sickening. I just can't understand how our whole system, like, this country is just so rotten. All of our politicians, it's crazy. I mean, we just had Netanyahu's visit to the White House. Right before that, we have, Trump saying the Epstein list doesn't exist. It's just, the whole thing is just sickening to me. And we just see how, Israel's such a tiny country, just how often I'm seeing our politicians tweet about how much they love Israel constantly during this horrific genocide. And it's just so clear that, like, what are they all pedophiles? Are they all on this list? Like, how is this possible? Like, yeah. I've lost faith in humanity now. Like how is, like, I know they're bad people, but there shouldn't be that many of them. And how did they all come into power? And they're all corrupted by this one evil state that is manipulated and has caused so much death and destruction, has destroyed my country, killed our military men and women, and just everything. It's just like it's disgusting. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, there may be something like we won't go into this in great detail. Like, the Epstein case and that kind of thing. Blackmail. It does happen. I don't deny it, and that may play a role. But I don't think it's a very big role. I mean, you don't need to have that. Again, you have a lot of people that, as living in Tennessee, there are a lot of people who really believe in Israel, and nobody has anything on them, right? They really do believe in Israel, and they fly the Israeli flag. And
I think I think it's becoming less common, though. I think people are getting uncomfortable with it now.
Yeah,
I'd like to think
I certainly hope so. Yeah, it probably is true. Again, but it's real, and it's there. And so I think a lot of these people are very sincere. They're just people like, a lot of people in the Trump administration, like Mike Huckabee, for example.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I don't think anybody has anything on him. And now, maybe somebody has something on Trump. There's that whole Epstein case. But you don't really need that to explain him, because he has this long history of being a real Zionist. And, his daughter converted to Judaism, married
Jared Kushner.
Yeah, right. So Kushner. I mean, that's right, Kushner, right? So he's part of that society, and I think he does occasionally seems to express some doubts about it, but all in all, he's a Zionist. He's delivered for them, and I think he's done so sincerely. Maybe there's a little bit of blackmail to push him even farther. I don't know. I'm not going to make any judgment on that. But you don't really even need to go to that to explain what's going on. It's a combination of money and ideology, and it's a very potent mix.
Right. Well, it also just seems like Israel controls the CIA. The intelligence agencies are part of this. They
have very close ties. I mean, that's true. They become. It just seems like it's hard for our rulers to really differentiate between American interests and Israeli interests. It's just like Israeli interests have become American interests in their thinking. And that's one of.
But there's this mass awakening happening, and this is what's so crazy, is that everybody understands, the vast majority of people understand that there is something seriously wrong with this relationship between the United States and Israel. I mean, we have all these prominent people all over the political spectrum. A lot of comedians, people like Tim Dillon or Theo Vaughn, a lot of sort of pop culture figures are saying like, hey, this is weird, this is wrong, big names. So, and it just seems to me apparent that I feel like Israel is going to become almost like a one voter issue for so many people in the future. Like as soon as I hear somebody say, any politician or anybody say like, oh, I stand with Israel, Israel's right to defend itself, it's like, get the F out of town. Lost my vote completely. Like I think it's getting to that point.
Right.
So I think we'll start to see that, right? We'll see what happens in the next elections. A lot of people are going to be like, all right, forget everything else. Let me hear your response, on Israel. If they say, I stand with Israel, compromise, you're out. Like this is America. It's not difficult. This should be a clear thing for voters. Right. I think that's where we're going to be heading, right?
We may be, there is, like we've said, there's been a real sea change, which is going to have an impact down the road. It's just a question of how far down the road are we going to go. Again, the old establishment is there, and they're going to fight, and but I think that their fall is inevitable. Their days are numbered. Just thinking, especially like when you get the comedians on the other side, then it's game over. It doesn't mean it's over, immediately, but that's just like, it tells you something about, what's actually happening in the culture. The zeitgeist has changed. It just, I think back to the 60s and
the zeitgeist, right?
Okay, zeitgeist. Okay, okay. But it used to be all the comedians were leftists, and that was true actually. And now, some of them are. When you come to Israel, it can be on both sides, though. It's not. it's but I don't think they never touched Zionism. I don't remember. That's something that was one of those electric third rails, and a lot of it, they. But that has changed. That's right. I mean, if what you're saying is true, and I don't follow these comedians, but I trust you, but I know you do. That means a lot. It's just like, what are people laughing at? That tells you where we are and where we're going.
Right. And and it's just becoming just more and more obvious as more and more people start to look at it and just point out the glaring hypocrisies and the glaring corruption and the unchecked influence that Israel has on our country. Then the response is to just prove that we're right, to say like, oh, we got to pass more anti-Semitism laws. Let's invite Benjamin Netanyahu over again. Everybody, all politicians start tweeting how much we love Israel again. Everybody start doing, it's like, everyone's like, this is the problem. This is, you're proving the point. So the more that, that people wake up, the more that we see them pull these levers of control and power and influence in the United States, and more people are like, yes, there you go. If we needed any further proof, it's here. So every day, that awakening is becoming more powerful and stronger, and it's, thank God for that. I thank God that finally this is happening. That people are just rejecting Zionism, rejecting Israeli control over our country. Get out of here with that. It's just, I hope that's a change.
Yeah, that's what the polls are showing. I mean, again, we've talked to them, and they've showed a dramatic shift over the last. It actually began before October 7th, but that shift is only accelerated. Especially in the younger generation. It's a different country. I mean, the AIPAC and these other Israel First organizations are in real trouble, and they clearly are worried, but they're responding in the way that you described, which I think in the end is self-defeating. It's just like they're showing their hand. They were much more effective when they could operate within the shadows, and they were the unseen power. Now that their influence, their interference has been exposed, that really does will make them weaker, and I think it will lead to their eventual demise.
I pray so. Okay, yeah. Well, just keep talking about it. It's great to see that shift, that awakening happening. Keep the pressure on, and maybe we can finally take our country back. All right, Dad. I think we can end it there.
Okay, sure.
Okay, have a good rest of your day.
Okay, you too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.